Tower Hill, London, July 6, 1535. The executioner's axe gleams in the morning light as England's most trusted advisor kneels before the block. Sir Thomas More, once the king's dearest friend, adjusts his simple gown and speaks his final words to the murmuring crowd. "I die, the king's good servant, but God's first." How did the man who Henry VIII called the Diamond of England come to this scaffold? How did a friendship forged in scholarship and laughter transform into a deadly battle of wills that would split a kingdom and cost a saint his head? The cold stone beneath More's knees tells a story older than empires, the eternal conflict between power and principle, between earthly loyalty and divine conscience. Around him, the tower's ancient walls have witnessed the fall of queens and nobles, but perhaps none whose death would echo through history quite like this. More's calm hands, once praised for their elegant penmanship and gentle touch with his beloved daughters, now tremble slightly as he removes his gray cap. The crowd falls silent. Even the executioner hesitates, for this is no ordinary traitor meeting his end. This is a man whose only crime was refusing to lie. In the shadow of the scaffold, one question haunts the morning air. In a world where kings demand to be gods, is integrity worth a life? History will remember Thomas More as England's most honest man. But should it? The axe rises, the crowd holds its breath, and the fate of conscience itself hangs in the balance. 21 years before that fatal morning, a different scene unfolds in the bustling streets of Tudor London. Thomas More enters the world as the eldest son of John More, a respected lawyer whose own integrity would one day inspire his son's unwavering principles. Born into a family where honesty was currency and education was salvation, young Thomas displayed a mind that sparkled like a rare jewel. At St. Anthony's School in Threadneedle Street, More's wit became legendary among his peers. His teachers marveled at a boy who could debate theology with grown men, yet still find joy in simple pleasures, writing comedies, playing music, and sketching portraits of his family. No one expected that such a gifted child, blessed with charm and intellectual brilliance, would one day choose death over compromise. The turning point came when Archbishop John Morton, observing the precocious boy's quick mind and gentle nature, declared him a marvelous man destined for greatness. Morton sent More to Oxford University, where he mastered Latin and formal logic with an ease that astounded his professors. But it was More's character, not just his intellect, that marked him as extraordinary. He possessed an almost childlike honesty that would prove both his greatest virtue and his fatal flaw. During these formative years, More's faith deepened alongside his learning. He spent time with Carthusian monks, rising at dawn for prayers, wearing a hair shirt beneath his clothes, practices that would sustain him through his darkest hours. His friends noted how he combined scholarly pursuit with genuine piety, never allowing knowledge to corrupt his simple devotion to truth. In 1499, destiny arrived in the form of Erasmus, the great Dutch humanist, who brought young More to meet 9-year-old Prince Henry at Eltham Palace. The boy who would become Henry VIII was immediately captivated by More's wit and warmth. A friendship was born that would reshape England and ultimately destroy one of them. Who could have foreseen that this meeting between two brilliant minds would end in betrayal, bloodshed, and the martyrdom of England's most beloved scholar? When Henry V ascended the throne in 1509, Thomas More believed he had witnessed the dawn of a golden age. The 18-year-old king was everything England had prayed for: brilliant, athletic, cultured, and devout. More wrote rapturously to Erasmus about this young man of the highest hopes who would restore justice and learning to the realm. What began as mutual admiration quickly deepened into something resembling love between intellectual equals. Henry showered More with honors and intimacy that dazzled the court. By 1518, More had become the king's personal secretary and confidant. Henry would arrive unannounced at More's Chelsea home, walking arm in arm through the gardens overlooking the Thames, discussing theology and philosophy for hours. Courtiers watched in amazement as the King of England treated this lawyer's son as his dearest friend and brother. But beneath the golden surface, subtle fractures were already forming. More's son-in-law, William Roper, later recalled congratulating his father-in-law on the royal friendship, only to receive a chilling response. "I find his grace my very good lord indeed, and I believe he doth as singularly favor me as any subject within this realm. However, son Roper, I may tell thee I have no cause to be proud thereof, for if my head could win him a castle in France, it should not fail to go." More understood Henry's nature in ways the court could not fathom. He saw the king's growing impatience with obstacles, his need to be not just obeyed but adored, his dangerous inability to accept the word no. When Henry began his pursuit of Anne Boleyn and his campaign for annulment from Catherine of Aragon, More watched his beloved friend transform into something unrecognizable, a man who would remake heaven and earth to satisfy his desires. The breaking point came gradually, then all at once. Henry's great matter, his desperate need to divorce Catherine and marry Anne, consumed him entirely. More's gentle attempts to counsel patience and acceptance of God's will were met with increasingly cold stares. The king who once treasured More's honesty now saw it as defiance. The friend who once sought his wisdom now demanded only his submission. By 1527, More realized with growing horror that his beloved prince had become a tyrant who would destroy anyone, even his dearest friend, who stood between him and his obsessions. The whispers began in the shadowed corridors of Greenwich Palace. How could England's most brilliant legal mind not see the obvious justice of the king's cause? Surely Thomas More, the man who wrote Utopia, understood that kings must be practical, that kingdoms require flexibility, that conscience is a luxury only the powerless can afford. When More was appointed Lord Chancellor in 1529, replacing the fallen Cardinal Wolsey, courtiers expected him to fall in line. After all, he now held the highest legal office in England. Surely he would embrace the king's vision of royal supremacy over the church. Instead, they watched in bewilderment as More systematically refused to involve himself in the divorce proceedings, claiming his conscience would not permit it. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's new chief minister, found More's position incomprehensible. In Cromwell's pragmatic world, survival trumped principle every time. He began subtly questioning More's judgment in council meetings. "Perhaps the Chancellor's great learning has made him overthink simple matters," Cromwell would suggest with a thin smile. "Sometimes the most educated men become paralyzed by their own sophistication." The narrative of More's supposed madness gained momentum when he resigned the chancellorship in May 1532. Who abandons power willingly? Who chooses poverty over prosperity? Isolation over influence? Court gossip painted More as a man consumed by religious fanaticism, a scholar whose obsession with abstract principles had severed his connection to reality. Anne Boleyn's supporters whispered that More's years of theological study had driven him to a kind of holy madness. They pointed to his hair shirt, his dawn prayers, his voluntary poverty as evidence of a mind unhinged by excessive piety. "He has become more monk than man," they murmured, "lost in dreams of martyrdom, while England needs practical leadership." Even More's silence was reinterpreted as sinister defiance. His refusal to publicly support the king's marriage was framed not as principled restraint, but as malicious obstinacy. The man who had once been praised for his unwavering honesty was now portrayed as dangerously stubborn, a relic of the old world clinging to outdated loyalties. The brilliant mind that had captivated Henry VIII was now being systematically redefined as the source of More's supposed madness. The trap was carefully constructed, each legal clause a steel bar designed to cage the conscience of England's most honest man. In March 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Succession, a document that appeared simple on its surface, but concealed within its text a spiritual guillotine aimed directly at Thomas More's neck. The act declared Anne Boleyn the rightful queen and her children legitimate heirs to the throne. Reasonable enough, except for the preamble that rejected papal authority over English ecclesiastical affairs and recognized Henry VIII as supreme head of the Church in England. Every subject must swear an oath accepting the entire act, not merely the succession itself. Thomas Cromwell had learned from More's resignation. This time there would be no escape through silence, no refuge in private conscience. The oath demanded public acknowledgement of Henry's spiritual supremacy, the one thing More's soul could never accept. Cromwell smiled coldly as he sealed the trap. Swear the oath and betray God, or refuse and face charges of treason. On April 12, 1534, the summons arrived at More's modest Chelsea home like a death warrant, dressed in legal parchment. He was commanded to appear at Lambeth Palace to take the oath. His daughter Margaret wept as she helped him prepare. Knowing this journey would likely be his last as a free man, at Lambeth Archbishop Cranmer and the king's commissioners waited with predatory patience. The oath lay before More on the table, its words burning like acid in his vision. Around him sat men who had already sworn, bishops, nobles, lawyers, all watching to see if England's former Chancellor would finally submit. More read the oath slowly, his scholarly mind parsing each phrase for any possible accommodation with his conscience. He found none. "I am not able to swear to the whole of this oath," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "I will not, however, condemn any man who has sworn." The commissioners exchanged glances. They had expected defiance, but this careful distinction, refusing to swear while also refusing to condemn others, revealed More's legal brilliance even in extremity. He would not give them the satisfaction of open rebellion, nor would he compromise his soul. Within hours, Thomas More was a prisoner at the Tower of London, his fate sealed by his refusal to choose between his king and his God. Tower of London, May 1535. The stone walls of the tower cannot contain a father's breaking heart. Through the narrow window of his cell, Thomas More watches the Thames flow past, carrying with it the echoes of laughter from his Chelsea home. Laughter that now seems like a dream from another man's life. 14 months of imprisonment have carved hollow shadows beneath his eyes, but his spirit remains unbroken when his beloved daughter Margaret arrives for what they both know will be their final meeting. Margaret Roper rushes into her father's arms with desperate intensity, as if she could somehow absorb his suffering into herself. the sight of England's former Chancellor, once the most powerful man in the realm after the king, now dressed in rough prison clothes, his beard grown long and unkempt, nearly destroys her composure. Yet it is not his physical decline that breaks her heart, but the terrible serenity in his eyes. "Sweet Meg," More whispers, using the pet name that has bound them since her childhood. "I have been these many days thinking of nothing but my passage out of this world." His hands, once elegant instruments of diplomacy and scholarship, now bear the calluses of a prisoner who has spent months in prayer and meditation. He holds her face gently, memorizing every feature as a man might study a precious manuscript before it is lost forever. Margaret pleads with him one final time to take the oath, to save himself for his family who needs him. Her words tumble out in desperate torrents. Surely God would understand. Surely Christ himself would forgive such a small compromise to preserve a life dedicated to his service. The tears streaming down her face blur her vision as she begs her father to choose life over principle. More listens with infinite patience, his love for this brilliant daughter, his intellectual equal and spiritual heir, written in every line of his weathered face. When she finishes, he speaks with the voice of a man who has already died to the world. "Meg, I have found that God makes the burden bearable when we walk in his path. I would rather suffer here for the space that God wills than to be free through offense to his divine majesty." The symbolic weight of the moment crushes down upon them both. Here sits a man who once dined with kings, who shaped the laws of England, who commanded the respect of scholars across Europe, now reduced to a prisoner whose only remaining possession is his conscience. Margaret understands with terrible clarity that she is not merely losing her father. She is witnessing the death of an entire world where integrity mattered more than survival. As she leaves the tower for the last time, Margaret carries with her the image that will haunt history. England's most honest man, choosing death over the smallest betrayal of truth. The bell tower becomes Thomas More's world, a circular stone cell barely 12 feet across, where England's former Chancellor must now measure his existence in the rhythm of prayers and the changing light through a single barred window. The man who once commanded audiences with kings now speaks only to his jailers and the rats that scurry across the cold floor. The order came from Henry VIII himself, sealed with the royal stamp that More had once helped to wield. Thomas More, being obstinate in his treasonous conceits, shall be kept close prisoner in our Tower of London until such time as it shall please our royal majesty. The phrase "close prisoner" carried brutal meaning: no visitors save by royal permission, no books except those approved by the crown, no correspondence with the outside world. At 56 years old, More's body rebels against the tower's harsh conditions. The damp stone walls weep moisture that soaks through his thin clothes, while the bitter Thames wind cuts through the barred window like a blade. His hands, once warmed by the fires of his Chelsea study, now crack and bleed from the cold. The man who had worn silk robes as Chancellor must now make do with coarse prison garb that chafes his skin raw. Yet it is not the physical hardships that constitute his true imprisonment, but the crushing weight of isolation from his beloved family. More had built his life around the laughter of his children, the warmth of family meals, the joy of teaching his daughters Latin and theology. Now, silence is his only companion, broken only by the distant tolling of church bells that mark the hours of his captivity. The psychological assault proves as calculated as the physical one. Henry knows that More's greatest strength lies in his relationships, his love for family, his joy in intellectual companionship, his need for meaningful conversation. By severing these connections, the king hopes to break the man who will not break his principles. But in the depths of the tower, something unexpected happens. Stripped of worldly comforts and human fellowship, Thomas More discovers a profound peace that his jailers cannot comprehend. The terrible freedom of a man who has nothing left to lose except his soul. By the winter of 1534, Thomas More has become a ghost of his former self. The man who once graced Henry's court with his wit and elegance now resembles a medieval hermit, his body slowly consumed by the tower's relentless cruelty. His hair, once carefully groomed for audiences with diplomats and scholars, has grown wild and gray, matching the unkempt beard that obscures his gaunt features. The cold seeps into his bones like a living thing, gnawing at joints already stiffened by months of sleeping on straw laid over stone. More's clothing, the same rough garments he was given upon arrival, has begun to rot on his body, the fabric disintegrating from dampness and wear. The stench of mold and human waste permeates his cell, a constant assault on senses once accustomed to the sweet air of Chelsea Gardens. Food arrives sporadically and in portions designed more to sustain life than to nourish it. Watery gruel, stale bread crawling with weevils, and occasionally a thin soup made from scraps. This becomes the diet of a man who once hosted elaborate feasts for Europe's greatest minds. More's body withers, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that grows more skeletal with each passing week. The tower's constable watches with clinical interest as England's former Chancellor deteriorates. This is no accident. Henry VIII has specifically ordered that More be given just enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. The king wants his former friend to understand viscerally what defiance costs, to feel in his failing flesh the consequences of opposing royal will. Worse than the hunger is the gradual assault on More's mental faculties. Months of isolation begin to blur the boundaries between waking and sleeping, between memory and dream. Sometimes he finds himself mid-conversation with Margaret or Erasmus, only to realize he is speaking to the stone walls. The brilliant legal mind that once navigated the complexities of international law now struggles to remember what day it is. Yet, even as his body fails, More's spirit undergoes a strange transformation. He writes to Margaret that he has never felt closer to God, never more certain of his purpose. The man who once worried about pleasing kings now finds peace in pleasing only his Creator. His jailers, expecting to find a broken man ready to compromise, instead discover a prisoner who grows more serene as his flesh weakens. The hair shirt he has worn for years, once a secret penance, is now revealed beneath his rotting prison clothes, its rough fibers embedded in skin scarred by months of wear. To his captors it appears as evidence of his madness. To More it becomes a final sacrament, a physical reminder that suffering can be a pathway to grace. In the tower's depths, Thomas More is dying slowly, but he is dying free. The footsteps echoing down the tower's corridors bring with them a flicker of possibility that Thomas More has not dared to feel in months. Thomas Cromwell arrives with an entourage of the king's commissioners, their fine clothes a stark contrast to the grim stone walls. For a moment, More allows himself to wonder if Henry has finally remembered their friendship, if mercy might yet triumph over pride. Cromwell enters the cell with theatrical confidence, carrying documents that rustle with the promise of freedom. His voice carries the smooth authority of a man who has bent countless wills to the crown's purpose. Sir Thomas, His Majesty offers you one final opportunity to reconsider your position. Swear to the act of supremacy, acknowledge the king as head of the Church in England, and you shall be restored to your family, your fortune, and the king's favor. More listens with the patience of a man who has had 14 months to examine his conscience. The offer hangs in the air like incense, so close he can almost taste the freedom it represents. He thinks of Margaret's tears, of his grandchildren who barely remember their grandfather, of the Chelsea home where his library gathers dust in rooms that echo with absence. Cromwell presses his advantage, painting vivid pictures of restoration. More could return to his studies, complete his theological works, spend his remaining years in peace with his beloved family. All for the simple expedient of acknowledging what Parliament has already declared law. Surely, Cromwell suggests with calculated reasonableness, conscience can accommodate such a minor adjustment to earthly realities. For a heartbeat, the cell fills with the weight of possibility. More's weakened body yearns for warmth, for clean clothes, for the simple pleasure of embracing his daughter without iron bars between them. The commissioners watch eagerly, certain that months of suffering have finally broken England's most stubborn man. Then More speaks, his voice quiet but unmoved. Master Cromwell, I thank His Majesty for his gracious offer, but I find myself, as I told you before, with my conscience pointing one way and unable to change the direction of that pointing. The hope that had briefly illuminated the cell dies like a candle snuffed by wind. Cromwell's face hardens with the realization that nothing, no suffering, no inducement, no threat, will move this man from his chosen path. The door slams shut with the finality of a tomb. The footsteps echoing down the tower's corridors bring with them a flicker of possibility that Thomas More has not dared to feel in months. Thomas Cromwell arrives with an entourage of the king's commissioners, their fine clothes a stark contrast to the grim stone walls. For a moment, More allows himself to wonder if Henry has finally remembered their friendship, if mercy might yet triumph over pride. Cromwell enters the cell with theatrical confidence, carrying documents that rustle with the promise of freedom. His voice carries the smooth authority of a man who has bent countless wills to the crown's purpose. Sir Thomas, His Majesty offers you one final opportunity to reconsider your position. Swear to the act of supremacy, acknowledge the king as head of the Church in England, and you shall be restored to your family, your fortune, and the king's favor. More listens with the patience of a man who has had 14 months to examine his conscience. The offer hangs in the air like incense, so close he can almost taste the freedom it represents. He thinks of Margaret's tears, of his grandchildren who barely remember their grandfather, of the Chelsea home where his library gathers dust in rooms that echo with absence. Cromwell presses his advantage, painting vivid pictures of restoration. More could return to his studies, complete his theological works, spend his remaining years in peace with his beloved family, all for the simple expedient of acknowledging what Parliament has already declared law. Surely, Cromwell suggests with calculated reasonableness, conscience can accommodate such a minor adjustment to earthly realities. For a heartbeat, the cell fills with the weight of possibility. More's weakened body yearns for warmth, for clean clothes, for the simple pleasure of embracing his daughter without iron bars between them. The commissioners watch eagerly, certain that months of suffering have finally broken England's most stubborn man. Then More speaks, his voice quiet but unmoved. "Master Cromwell, I thank His Majesty for his gracious offer, but I find myself, as I told you before, with my conscience pointing one way and unable to change the direction of that pointing. The hope that had briefly illuminated the cell dies like a candle snuffed by wind." Cromwell's face hardens with the realization that nothing, no suffering, no inducement, no threat, will move this man from his chosen path. The door slams shut with the finality of a tomb. The head of Thomas More adorned London Bridge for only 14 days before his daughter Margaret, in an act of desperate love, bribed the bridge keeper to let it fall into her lap as she passed beneath in the boat. She preserved it with spices and was buried with it 9 years later, taking her father's final earthly remains to rest beside her heart. Even in death, More inspired fierce devotion from those who understood that they had witnessed something beyond the ordinary martyrdom of political opposition. History's judgment arrived with ironic swiftness. Within 3 years of More's execution, Henry VIII had grown tired of Anne Boleyn and ordered her beheaded on charges as fabricated as those used against More. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of More's destruction, followed his victim to the scaffold in 1540. Executed by the same king he had served so ruthlessly, the very system that destroyed More ultimately consumed its creators, leaving his principled refusal to compromise looking less like madness and more like prophetic wisdom. 400 years later, the Catholic Church declared Thomas More a saint, recognizing what his contemporaries could not see, that his seemingly futile stand against royal supremacy represented something eternal in the human spirit. Pope Pius IX canonized him in 1935, exactly 4 centuries after his execution, proclaiming him the patron saint of lawyers and politicians. The irony cuts deep. A man condemned as a traitor by his own government became a model of conscience for the world. But More's legacy transcends religious boundaries. In an age when compromise is often praised as wisdom and flexibility celebrated as virtue, his story poses uncomfortable questions that echo across the centuries. When does accommodation become collaboration? When does pragmatism become cowardice? In a world where conscience often yields to convenience, Thomas More stands as an eternal challenge to our own moral flexibility. Today, visitors to the Tower of London can see the cell where More spent his final months, now marked with a simple plaque. The stone walls that witnessed his suffering remain unchanged, but the world has transformed around them. England, the nation that killed him for his faith, now honors him as one of its greatest sons. The Church of England, born from his martyrdom, acknowledges him as a man of principle worthy of respect. Was Thomas More England's most honest man, or simply its most stubborn? Perhaps the question misses the point entirely. In choosing death over dishonesty, in preferring truth to survival, he achieved something rarer than mere honesty. He achieved integrity so complete that it could not be broken even by the King of England. The scaffold is empty now. The conscience remains eternal.